Hello everyone, this is Karen. Welcome to Language Sample Elicitation using SALT. This is for the Appleton Area School District SLPs, so let's get started. So language sampling has some aims, and we really want to strive to get language from the student that really accurately represents what they can do, what they typically do, so that we know we're getting a snapshot of what the referral reason is, or the difficulties that have been described to you, and that demonstrates why they're coming to SLPs for either remediation or because they're being evaluated. We want to make sure that the language sample challenges the speaker enough. It's not going to be too easy, it's not going to be too hard. I think John mentioned before that sweet spot, that Goldilocks kind of method that we're looking for, that just right kind of language sample. And it's usually pretty easy to get. We want to get a sample that represents the functional language use, the authentic language to the student that's natural. And we know that it's not contrived, like we might get from a standardized test. And of course we want something that's reliable. So if we did it again, would we get similar language? The Optimum language sample always gives us the maximum information about the speaker's abilities and their language and their typical language production. It's going to show us both their strengths and their weaknesses, and we hope that it motivates them to give us a representative and reliable sample. So we want to talk about picking a good context to do that, and we'll do that later. And of course, we want to be able to have a sample that optimizes the opportunity for us to interpret results. So we really want to get a great sample that gives us a bit of everything that we're interested in finding. Choosing a sampling condition is the most critical step, in my opinion, of LSA. So we need to find the sample that does all the things we just talked about. And that means we have to learn and understand all the contexts that there are available to us, because different linguistic contexts give different linguistic output. So things to consider are the developmental ages and production of the student. So consider their chronological age, what developmentally is someone of a young age able to do versus an older age student. And of course, the stage of their linguistic development, which may or may not match their chronological age. So we also want to know, is the sample functional? So how do the language difficulties manifest themselves? So a preschool student, we're going to be using things like play and conversation. But school-aged kids who have more advanced language, we can kind of look into areas of the curriculum to tap into their language skills, and we may see the language difficulties that they have displayed in the curriculum. We also want to consider the interpretive process. So what is our plan when we analyze a sample? Is it going to be, real-time transcription where we're just looking at anecdotal information? Well, not for this group. So we're going to be using SALT's protocols and hopefully SALT's reference databases, because if you don't have a reference database, you're going to have to make sure you rely on the developmental norms that you have available to you, the expectations and milestones that we know about speakers over time, and of course our clinical expertise is required to interpret the results of a language sample. So, when we are working with you guys, we're hoping to, show you SALT as an analysis tool so that you have those reference databases for comparison. And there are always going to be students for which there isn't a database at this time. And so you will need to know, and you will learn how to use SALT's analysis menu, called the Analyze menu, where you won't have a database, but you will be able to use your clinical skills to interpret. The other thing is are you going to be looking at change over time? So time 1 against time 2? Are you going to be looking at language 1 versus language 2? Are you going to be able to look at context 1, context 2? So conversation against a narrative, for example. These are all options in the interpretive process. We always want to consider the goal of the sample, and we've kind of touched on this. What we want to learn from the sample is extremely important as to how we choose what kind of sample we're going to get. Are we just looking at language production in general? Are we looking to document progress over time developmentally or just due to therapy? Are we looking for a specific linguistic skill or something you've been working on? For example, if you're going to try to look at pronoun use, you might want to have a context where you know pronouns are going to come into play. For example, if you want exchange of information, turn taking, topic maintenance, those kinds of things are going to happen in a conversation. If you want to know about the elements of story grammar or macrostructure, you're going to go leaning towards a narrative. If you're going to have a description of an event or an activity, then you're going to use a different kind of sample. If you're going to persuade, you're going to use a persuasion. So you'll see here that you got to think about, what do I want to get and what context will help me get that? The sampling contexts that SALT has and that are available everywhere. I mean, we're all familiar with conversations and plays. You need to kind of know your developmental norms. You know, you have to understand that if you want to get narrative skills, you're not going to get that from a 2 or 3-year-old. We start to see narrative develop at 4. 5-year-olds are usually pretty good at that. And obviously you're not going to have an elementary school child try to persuade you. You can do that, but you won't have a database for comparison. So kind of be thinking about your age of opportunity and the linguistic abilities that these kids have when you're eliciting. So let's talk about play. Conversation and play can be elicited as soon as children can talk. Usually 2 years and up to about 5 years, or grades pre-K or kindergarten. SALT's databases have samples from 2.8 to 5.8. We know that young kids are most comfortable in play. It's a great way to establish rapport. Familiar listeners or familiar partners with these students typically get more language from them. Parents are often, able to get more than a newly encountered adult. It depends on the student, however. Some kids are very comfortable with less familiar adults. And parents sometimes aren't great at getting samples without interrupting and overlapping. So you have to kind of pick your battles there. You can either train the parent a little bit if you think they're going to get the better information, or whomever is more familiar as an adult with the student, teach them to let the child take the lead and not try to talk too much. And then, we always have to adjust the context to meet the child's needs. So we want to make sure in a play sample that we have their preferences and their interests in mind, and we want to be, of course, always, not just in play, aware of any kind of cultural nuances. So always a good idea with play is to talk to parents, teachers, caretakers. What does this kiddo like to talk about? What are they familiar with? What would they know to talk about? So that always sets us up for a better sample. The thing about play that's good is it will get you these social aspects of their language use. So it's good for late talkers or kids with developmental disabilities, really good with kids on the spectrum who have any sort of discourse issues. It can be used with kids with neurological disorders if those disorders impact linguistics. Also really good to get nonverbal communication skills and assessment of those. And in that case, I would always suggest using a video instead of audio only, because obviously those nonverbal communication skills show up that way. Tips and rules for play. These are probably pretty obvious. You need to be on the child's level. When you're playing with a student, you're not going to be sitting at your desk while they're on the floor, obviously. Toys and tangibles are obviously necessary for a play sample, and we want to make sure that there are different types of play available to the student in terms of what their level of ability is. So can they do symbolic play where they might use a broom to ride a horse? Are they able to role play and pretend, so they're pretend to making pancakes, for example, and then can have that dialogue over it. We have, I think, discussed this at least sometime in the past, that when you have things like the Fisher-Price farm or Little People, it creates opportunities for kids to use reference, which is really nice when you're eliciting. Having toy characters means that you have things that you can direct comments to and refer to, and it's a nice opportunity to assess a student's language that way. We always want to let the child initiate and be the leader whenever possible. Of course, every situation and every student is different. You're going to sometimes have those very quiet, very shy, very reticent students. In that case, our role is a little more involved. But if you have a student who's willing to speak and is verbal and wants to go, then we limit our questions and we limit, interruptions and overlaps. And of course, we want to make sure they know we're engaged and interested, so we can comment and we can, affirm and, say a few things here and there. Pauses are fine. It's fine to be patient and wait. It's uncomfortable for some of us, but it is fine. Kids are much less at that age aware of pauses and quiet time. They're not nearly as uncomfortable as we might be. And excuse me, very important, if you're sending this for transcription or transcribing it yourself, try very hard to gloss unintelligible speech, because that will only help us with the outcomes later. Of course, don't guess, but if you know what was said, let us know by glossing, or let yourself know if you're going to transcribe it yourself. Conversations. These are conversations with another adult partner, so you can collect those at any time throughout the lifespan. Our databases have samples from ages 2-9 to 13-3. Conversations are great because they get to discourse and they get to those social language skills. So we'll see turn taking, we'll look at topic initiation and topic maintenance and the ability to let go of the floor or hold the floor. Also, will a student repair communication breakdowns or give you clarification? Will they understand they need to, or will you have to ask for it? We can get to question asking and question answering to see if those questions and those responses are appropriate or ignored or inappropriate responses. And we always get the nice assessment of spontaneity. Where's this student going? And what pops up, and how will the conversation go? Will it lead to new topics? Will it be a smooth transition? So those are nice things that happen with conversation. Conversation lets us know, does a student listen attentively? Do they interrupt a lot or not a lot? Can the student speak only what needs to be said, or are they all over the place, taking us down different avenues and channels? Are they saying what's relevant to what we're talking about now, or what's present, or are they, again, bopping all over the place? So conversation is good for those kinds of kids that you want to get that information from. When you're in a conversation, one thing I'll back up and say is that language sampling often in an assessment, especially initial, it can be a great first way to establish rapport, just the language sampling itself. So in the beginning of a conversation or any kind of language sample, you can establish rapport in those first few minutes. Sometimes that really opens it up for a very comfortable session. So we know that, we're going to take those first few minutes to do that. And if it's strained, you don't have to transcribe that. If things get better as time goes on, then you lop off that strained, less good productions, unless you want those as part of your transcript and the analysis. But a strained sample can lead to less spontaneity, less language, and it may not exactly reflect what the speaker can do. So, you can always play with conversation, go a little bit longer, and then take, the better part of the language for the analysis if you want to do that. That's the beauty of the flexibility of those. Conversations require that, we ask age-appropriate questions and only one question at a time. And I can say, as the transcription person here at SALT, we do get the multiple questions at a time from examiners a lot. We also get a lot of yes-no questions, which often just lead to yes-no answers. So we try to ask people to avoid those, and also those specific WH questions like, who is this? Well, that's going to give you a name. So we try to get more of those I wonder, I think, I wish kinds of statements out, so that it gives us, the student, the opportunity to speak more and not, excuse me, answer so specifically. Also, this comes across my desk quite a bit where a speech path who knows a family will say, do you have any brothers and sisters? And I've heard students say, you already know I do. So you don't really necessarily want to ask questions where the kiddo knows you know the answer, because that just screams this is not a real authentic conversation. And then, of course, this does happen. It's easy to have happen. It happens to everyone at some point or another. You're starting a conversation and then somehow you hit a topic that becomes a narrative. So we try to avoid that by asking questions like, tell me about a movie you just saw, because that, although, you know, is a topic, it is going to give you a narrative at some point. So when you use the SALT database for a conversation and you want to compare your conversation, you should follow our protocols, and you'll hear this over and over again. Our protocols are important to be familiar with and to follow. So some of those conversational topics, if you're going to compare, the apples to apples comparison, include classroom activities such as tell me about things you've been doing in school, birthdays or celebrations, you know, did anybody have a birthday in your family? Did you? Tell me about your birthday. Any kinds of celebrations. Activities like vacations, those are part of our protocols. Family pets. Do you have a pet? You know, how do you take care of your pet? And of course, holidays. If something is relevant, you can talk about that. Narratives. So narratives are nice because they require less from us, the examiner, which can increase examiners' confidence. And some people come to language sampling with a little bit of fear, and that's okay. I mean, until you do it a lot, it can be a little bit of pressure. So that's the nice thing about a narrative, is there's not very much needed from us in a narrative. And also, if you're a person who does get anxious or wants to talk due to anxiety, sometimes those narratives, you know, allow us to decrease our interference or our influence on the sample, because we're not supposed to talk so much. Narratives have a great logical order. They elicit the elements of story grammar. So you're asking speakers to recall sequences of actions or events. You're asking for organization from them. Out of space and time is nice, you get that. And they're just typically more challenging than a conversation, and they're also more text-based, more aligned with the curriculum. Also, narratives tend to elicit longer, more complex utterances than conversations do. And the limit of a narrative is that you'll not get discourse measures. You'll not see the turn taking, or you shouldn't see any of that, because that's not what you're aiming to get. Narrative language samples, and I think I mentioned, you know, narratives start to emerge around age 4. You know, if you have a kiddo who is, you know, being evaluated, likely if there's a delay, you're not going to get a narrative at age 4. We ask that you use our protocols if you're going to compare your narrative to a SALT reference database. And what we have in our databases are narrative where the student selects the story samples. And what that means is the student is talking about an event or a TV episode, a book, you know, something they've just recently seen or done or read or partaken in that has a story to it. So tell me about a TV show you watched. Tell me about your favorite story. The speaker is familiar with the content, so they're able to give you a good description and narrative of what they just did or saw. It will look at organization. It should get some dialogue use. Obviously, you'll see some referencing, and you'll get all that macro structure information. Those narrative student selects the stories tend to be pretty short. And our database has samples from kids kindergarten through 2nd grade, 3rd, 5th, and 7th. So there are some holes there. Just be aware of that. Our story retell database, we have an English fluent database that includes ages 4.4 to 12.8, or grades pre-K through 6. Our bilingual Spanish-English database samples are from 5.0 to 9.9, or grades K through 3. And that's important to be mindful of, because we'll often get someone who has a 6th grader who's bilingual Spanish-English, and they will have given us a frog, where are you sample. Well, that isn't a fair comparison to our database. So we often have to say, what do you want us to do with this? Do you want us to just use the Analyze menu? Just be aware that we don't have anybody in 4th, 5th, or 6th grade who is a bilingual Spanish-English speaker. The good thing about the story retells is that the content is familiar to both you, the examiner, and the speaker. So that really helps with the whole flow and understanding of getting that language sample. You really know when the student is way off, and you won't probably need to request clarification, because you'll get that something's not right, and maybe that is a time to assess if the student knows that they're off, or if they're aware of it, and how you bring them back. It looks at organization, dialogue use, macrostructure features, and again, very little interaction is required from us. We really don't want to be a part of this narrative. It is not a conversation. It is to see if the student can retell a story that was just heard and seen. So our interaction is very little. Tell me more, keep going, quiet affirmations, nods, great. Usually not much has to happen with us. We also have expository samples, which are procedural narrations, and this is for older students, grades 5 through 7 and 9 through 12, so ages 10-7 to 18-9. And what we're doing is asking the student how to play a favorite game or sport. So they're very familiar with what they choose to talk about. They should be. They're not going to pick a game or sport about which they know nothing. And it's our job to make sure that they don't do that, but they usually don't. It's going to look at organizational skills that are required for description, to provide information, to tell their listener very clearly and logically how to play that game or that sport. We see this as a necessary skill in middle and high school curriculum in life. And so it's a nice sampling context. This one has a protocol where the students get to plan for a few minutes first with a graphic organizer or a planning sheet, which is nice for them, and it's nice for you to see them doing that. So it's a good, nice, logical, clear, easy to follow protocol for both the student and for the examiner. The persuasion samples, also for older children, are similar in that they also have a very nice clean protocol and a planning sheet for students to work with first. The idea of the persuasion is for the student to be able to convince you as the listener to accept their point of view, and to bring you over to their side. So it's a skill that's necessary in life as well. And our database samples are grades 9 through 12, or ages 14.8 through 18.4, so it goes up pretty high. It's going to look at how a student can support their argument, can convince you, can convey their ideas, and can accept another point of view. So the nice thing about it is they have a choice of a lot of options from which to choose from. In terms of, topics for persuasion. They also can choose something of their own, not on the choice that we give, not from the choices that we give them. And you'll hear passion in their voices if they are interested in this task. You'll also notice that these persuasions, as compared to expositions, tend to get students to give us a little bit more complex syntax. They're a little shorter than the expositories, but they seem to go into this mode where they really want to impress. So they give us some of that adult language that they've got shored up in their back pocket. It's really interesting to listen to them. So narrative student selects the story, and narrative retell samples are another two sets of databases that we have. And those samples get to story grammar and macro structure, and you will see, hopefully, you'll be able to assess the introduction, the character development, some mental state use, And referencing is always one of the biggies with our kids. You know, are they using pronouns or personal pronouns? And are we clear on who they are referencing? You'll get to all the plots and themes, the conflicts and resolutions in the story, the cohesion, which is also a troublesome area for many of our kids. You know, does this thing flow? Is it all over the place? And then can they conclude? Again, this type of sampling, narratives in general, do align closely with the language arts curriculum and the federal and state language standards like the Common Core standards. So length of samples. Well, that depends on a lot of things. Obviously, the speaker's age and ability and their personality, right? So if you have a chatty kid, they're probably going to give you a lot more language and probably in as long as you want them to go. And you can get more language in a shorter time. If you have a reticent speaker, it's going to be a little bit harder. And then you have to decide, you know, is the reticence a true snapshot of what they can do, or is it because I'm not familiar? Again, you can always go get a different sample at another time, or even at the same time. You can start with a different context. So that's the nice thing about language sampling, is its flexibility there. The sampling context, so you're going to need more time for a conversation than you would a story retell to get the same number of utterances. Conversations typically, because there's so much more on the part of the examiner, are just longer too. And the examiner's behaviors obviously influence that speaker's opportunities. So again, we've talked about this. If you ask a lot of yes/no questions or specific WH questions, you're going to get short one-word answers. If you interrupt a lot or overlap a lot, that language is confounded, and so you'll have to get more language. And obviously, if you ask too many questions, the last one typically is the one answered, and that may not be the one you want answered. So our research shows that getting 50 complete, intelligible, verbal target speaker utterances gives you very robust language outcomes. And when, of course, you're doing a narrative, you have to do the entire story from beginning and end, because you want to get the overall structure of the narrative, so that those macro structure elements. Elicitation tips, I think we all learned these in college, and it's important that we go over them again, because when you're in the moment, it's different than when you're thinking about being in the moment. So before you take a language sample, kind of get yourself mindful about letting that target speaker take the lead, and also being a sincere partner. This is, I think, what I mentioned about real-time transcription that I don't like, is that you aren't fully present if you're taking notes, if you're in your mind tabulating and marking things of note, even on paper or just in your mind. So we really want you to be fully present and be interested in what's being said. Eye contact is important, you know, nods of affirmation at the appropriate time, really showing the student that you understand and that you're there and that you're in the moment. Of course, if you have to request clarification, that's just telling in and of itself. So if that's necessary, you can go ahead and do that. Or if you don't, that's something that you should have a mindful choice about, because you're letting that sample go and noting that, this child didn't repair on his or her own. Obviously, be friendly and enthusiastic. I think we all come to the table knowing how to work with kids and have good body language and smiles and good inflection and dynamic speech. Patience is important, because we can go in with a rapid rate because we're in a hurry, and that can cause kind of a pressure on the student. We don't want to do that. We want to be patient and have a good rate and allow the speaker time to process what we say, to formulate what they want to say, and to produce their best language. And those awkward pauses can be very telling. So let them be, because if it's part of their typical production style and it's a problem in communication, we want to capture that for data and to look at change over time if that's something we're going to work on. Also, if you don't let pauses happen, there are going to be more interruptions and overlaps, making transcription harder. And I will say typically the interruptions and overlaps happen more by the examiner than from the student. Now, if the student has that characteristic, we of course want to capture that as well. So your next steps in our little project here is that you're going to choose one student from which you will collect a language sample. You're going to have to be real mindful about the elicitation contexts. Now that you know a little bit about them, you can go and research more about those on our website under the Resources tab. When you go in to look at the databases, all the protocols are there. There are all kinds of information about how to elicit the sample, who is in, who you would be comparing to, who are in the reference databases, and exactly how to take those samples. You're going to review and print your elicitation instructions because it's important that you go over them more than one time. You don't have to print them, but it's handy. And here's an example here of, what our protocol might look like. The scripts for the frog stories are there. You'll see there the expository planning sheet for the students. All of that can be found on our website and is necessary when you're going to take those kinds of samples. So following the protocol, we need that to happen. I've said it probably 11 times, and I probably will say it 11 more. If you are going to compare to a SALT reference database, you have to follow a protocol. It is an apples to apples comparison that way. So we know how these were designed, and they were designed with intent to get natural language use, the best use we can get, the best authentic functional language we can get out of these students. They are standardized. These processes are repeatable. And so this helps us to get consistent and reliable data. It's very similar to a standardized test. The process is standardized. So you need to follow those protocols in order to follow this standardization. Be consistent so that when you do it time 1 and time 2, you have valid and reliable data over time. So again, the apples to apples, follow the protocols. When you collect, have everything ready. Pre-plan, get your toys out before the student comes in. Have your planning sheets ready. Know your protocols. Have your recording device with you, usually a phone, but it can be external recorders. Laptops record. Anything that you can record on is going to be pretty good in nowadays, unless you have something very antiquated. Please have a quiet space. If you can get rid of some hard surfaces, if you're in a room with no carpet, those echoes can really ruin a good sample. Ambient noise can ruin a good sample. If you're in a lunchroom with all that background noise, and this happens a lot, we can get really good samples from which you cannot reliably transcribe because of so much extraneous noise. So make sure you have the practiced protocol available, and practiced there is highlighted, because if you think that you can go just take a sample without having read through that protocol or even kind of saying it out loud to yourself 1 or 2 times, I think you will be a little bit stunned at how not easy that is. So just have some time set aside to have read those and maybe said them out loud to yourself 1 or 2, or whichever one you're going to use. So this is very similar to a standardized test. You have to learn them, you have to practice them, and then you have to do them. Only it's way more fun to take a language sample, and the kids like it more. It's not a test. I think we talked about recording devices. Most people use their phones. Voice recorder is on an iPhone. Digital recorders now are very inexpensive, so if that's something you'd prefer to do, those are easy too. When you go upload your sample to SALT for transcription, you'll go to saltsoftware.com. You'll see there's a tab for the Transcription Upload Site. The only way you're going to be able to do that, though, is if you have already created an account on SALT. So that's just your username that you choose and a password. And we prefer that all school district SLPs who work with us use their school district email. That way we can associate you with your school district and the project that you are working on and from and with. This is a snapshot, a screen capture of what the upload form looks like. It's very self-explanatory. You'll pick the context, whether it's an expo or a persuasion or a retell. If you want us to score for the subordination index or NSS, if you choose a story retell, the narrative scoring scheme will be an option for you too, which is the rubric that looks at all that macro structure. And I would highly suggest if you do take a sample that is a story retell that you ask for that narrative scoring scheme. Subordination index is clausal density measure, so it's nice for looking at complex syntax. Then you'll just fill in a sample ID. The chronological age of the student is necessary if you want us to run measures. You don't have to put that in if you're going to run your own. And in your cases, we're hoping you will be the one who runs the measures, so you will want to have just the SALT transcript sent back to you. In your case, when you do upload, there is a comments box that you don't see here, but you will put in that comments box that this is for the Appleton School District project, so that our project manager knows that this is for you guys at no fee. So here are some references in case you want to learn a little more and have a little information about what was said here. And I want to say thank you for listening and good luck with your sampling.